a kind of reminder that methods themselves aren't critical or multicultural. However, there are some that might lend themselves a little bit more to it, which is something that Dr. Strunk has mentioned to us in a course here at VCU. We're also going to hear from our panelists about how they design critical or multicultural research, and then also discuss research methods within breakout rooms. So we'll have some time to kind of collaborate with each other. All this work does not get done by someone by themselves. So this is a good opportunity to kind of work together and build some community. We'll also engage our panelists in a Q&A session. So please think of questions that you might be interested in learning more from our wonderful panelists. You can drop them in the chat. Feel free to message them to Allison or myself. And if things come up in your breakout room, definitely feel free to ask those questions when we come back after the breakout rooms. And then we'll also hear about what's next in this series. So before we jump in, and actually, on the screen, you'll see a QR code to our session folder for the series, and this will have different resources either shared during each session or that we have put together. Thank you for putting that link in the chat. And so this will be a place where you can always come back to kind of see what we've talked about and see those resources so you can continue reflecting. And then before we jump in, we're going to talk a little bit about these defining what we mean by multicultural and critical research. And so we've kind of curated these definitions from looking at the literature. However, there's definitely many different ways to define them, and these are not encompassing all definitions by any means. But multiculturalism, how we've defined it, is a search to elevate perspectives that have been silenced in traditional scholastic narratives, and it attempts to invite in the histories and experiences of people and culture that have been left outside of the curriculum. And then Marvin Lin sees critical research as rooted in critical race theory. CRT began in law and is a critique of race and racism in law and the broader society. There's also more definitions of critical research as well, and they're all focused on really looking at these social inequities that we have and moving forward. However, we are focusing kind of on critical race theory. And when applied to educational psychology, we view critical scholarship in EdPsych as a critique of race and racism in learning environments. And so this definition, as I mentioned, is definitely not the definition of critical scholarship in educational psychology, but instead a very concise statement from our current understanding, definitely with a focus on race and racism and CRT. So critical race researchers must turn from problem posing orientation to also problem solving orientation. And Gloria Ladson-Billings has actually kind of done a critique of some work in education. So we want to make sure that we're looking at action and agency. So we're calling on education scholars to be dissatisfied with only offering critique for the sake of critiques, but also what we can do next. So I think Dr. Jamal Matthews mentioned that in a talk that he gave a few years ago, but really thinking about what is our next step in our research from just exploring inequities. So I include these definitions, and Temi really created these, so not quite me, but Temi more so, because without these definitions, there's almost a disservice to the vast research done in education that's addressing these critical approaches to research. For example, all the people that have been on our panels have been doing this work for years, and it's not that anyone is just starting this work, but many of the people on our panels have been laying the groundwork for years for us to get to this place in educational psychology where we're having these discussions. So we have a lot of information on the problems that racism causes, and most importantly, acknowledging the impacts of racism draws on the assumption that racism, sexism, and all other oppressive isms are rooted in structural and systemic problems. And this allows researchers to move beyond deficit framings that blame individuals for the problems they face and instead question and challenge the structures and systems that perpetuate the problems that learners, parents, educators, and other individuals in the learning environments we investigate are facing, and I'd even include ourselves as researchers as well. So since the focus of this session is on methods, we took some time to develop a quick list of common components for multicultural and critical research methods. And this was through brainstorming, also reading Dr. Kumar and Dr. Taquir Gumby's work and their new article. There's a citation on the screen, so definitely please check out that article. That really goes into the history of educational psychology, where we have areas for growth and some ways that we can improve as a field. So first, critical and multicultural research methods center culture and race. We have a few examples here. So looking at getting in-depth understandings of specific racial and ethnic groups. We know from a lot of work that Dr. Taquir Gumby has done, as well as Dr. Graham, and that psychology and EdPsych in particular centers a lot on white middle-class samples, and then also hasn't really looked at race and ethnicity in our research. Also looking at in-group and intergroup variability, so not only just between groups, but also really getting a better understanding of people with different backgrounds and their experiences. We also really want to emphasize that this work also situates data collection in systems and structures that perpetuate racial oppression. So not only just looking at these individual constructs, but making sure that we are looking at oppression in the context that we are collecting data. And so that's just a few, but there's much more than that. But those are some ones that we wanted to highlight. And so now I'll pass it back over to Allison to get us started with our panelists. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Corey. So we'll get started moving through learning from our panelists. Today, we are joined by Dr. Carlin Adams-Wiggins, who is an assistant professor of applied developmental psychology at Portland State University. We also have Dr. Kevin Coakley, who is a university diversity and social transformation professor of psychology and an associate chair for diversity initiatives at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Jessica Taquir Gumby, who is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Southern California. So I'll start off, would love to have each of you tell us a summary in about a sentence or so of your research interests or program with a particular eye for the questions that you ask. And we can start with Dr. Adams-Wiggins, move to Dr. Coakley, and then Dr. Taquir Gumby.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I guess the quick version for me would be that I address social interactions that are involved in producing identities, specifically in science learning contexts, but also for Black youth in and out of school. And that's the quick version. So.
Good afternoon. So my research can be broadly categorized in the area of African-American psychology, where I examine specifically the psychosocial experiences of African-American and other minoritized students on issues related to identity, achievement, mental health, and feelings of imposterism.
So good afternoon from sunny California. I study the educational experiences of African-American students, and I focus on race and racial identity development. I also focus on emotions and coping as it pertains to racism, but I see myself as a practical methodologist and also write about critical race theory and mixed methods research.
Well, thank you all so much. So the first question we're going to get a little bit bigger today is thinking about what are the practices that researchers should keep in mind when developing their methods and collecting and analyzing data for projects with critical and multicultural foundations. I'll throw that in the chat so you can read it over for sure. And let's start with Dr. Coakley, then we'll move to Dr. Taquir Gumby and Dr. Adams-Wiggins.
Thank you for the question, Allison. And as you know and remember, this is one of the issues that I talked about quite frequently in my issues in multicultural research class that I taught for many years at the University of Texas. So there are a few practices that I would point out that researchers should keep in mind. And some of these may seem, common sense, like common sense, and others, might cause you to think a little bit more. So the first example that I would give is to not assume that ethnic differences are related to culture if, in fact, you have not directly assessed for cultural measures, cultural factors in the research. So what do I mean by this? So oftentimes when people are doing research and they have really diverse samples, one of the first things that they want to do is to be able to sort of try to explain any sort of differences that they see amongst the diverse samples that they have. And this is, I think almost human nature. It's interesting to be able to say these differences exist because of X. The problem, of course, with that is that you can't really explain differences if especially ethnic differences, if you haven't specifically accounted for or measured cultural variables. And yet this happens all the time when you go to discussion sections and you're reading about what they are saying, what the researchers are saying about their findings. They are introducing all sorts of interpretations of culture that in fact were not measured in the study itself. There were no specific and direct measures of culture, and yet they are offering explanations that are wrapped in culture. All you can do if you are in fact reporting differences is to describe the differences. So in a very descriptive manner. You can't explain them, you can't provide an explanation for them. All you can do is just describe them. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that you should try to use proximal factors that obviously are more close to the phenomena that you're interested in, rather than more distal factors. Again, very sort of basic information, but what do we mean by that? So oftentimes people will use race and ethnicity and culture as explanations for the phenomena that they are examining. Well, race, ethnicity, and culture are really distal factors. They in and of themselves don't explain the findings. But what might be a better way to explain the findings could be the more proximal manifestations of those constructs. So racial identity, ethnic identity, values, acculturation. So proximal variables are more psychological in nature and really are more appropriate to try to explain phenomena rather than using the more distal variables of race, ethnicity, and culture. And then finally, I would end by really cautioning you about using a comparative research framework when you are, when you have two or more samples, particularly when you're talking about having minoritized samples and predominantly white samples. There have been too many examples where individuals use this comparative research framework and the de facto sort of exemplar is a white standard by which all other minoritized groups are being compared. We have many examples in the literature where this has taken place. I give examples in my class of how individuals have been turned down from grants, have not gotten published because they did not or refused to use this sort of comparative research framework where white is the de facto sort of standard or frame of reference. So those are just sort of three quick practices that I would, caution individuals to consider when they're doing this sort of research.
I agree with everything you said. I do want to kind of add a couple of things, and I may even repeat some of the things that Kevin's talked about. I think that, when you're engaging in kind of critical multicultural work, you can even use whatever method best answer your questions. But I think a lot of the critical multicultural work tends to be more qualitative. But you need to use the research method that you're most comfortable in using. And if you want to do qualitative work, for instance, you need to learn how to use qualitative work. It's nothing worse than a quantitative researcher that sounds like a quantitative researcher doing qualitative work. So, you want to do, qualitative work, that's great, but learn how to use the methods. Whatever methods you want to use, learn how to use those methods. And take the time to learn how to use it. I mean, if I want to start a new research line, I'm not just going to tomorrow say, hey, I'm an expert in this line. It takes time to do that. You have to learn, you have to read, you have to engross yourself in that literature. You might have to work with someone. You have to put in that time to learn how to do that. The same goes for critical work. You just don't just wake up tomorrow and say, hey, I think I'm gonna use this critical lens to study this topic. No, you have to put in the time to really focus on how to do that. So, it takes time to be grounded in that real research literature. And your work really does need to be grounded in that research literature. So actually, to the research literature, particularly of people of color, scholars of color who have been working on this for decades, and make sure your work does, rightfully cite that group. I think for me, looking at race as a construct and not just a demographic variable. I think a lot of people say, I'm gonna study Black people and Latinos and Asians, and then kind of compare them. Oh, I'm doing this, critical work. No, I mean, we need to look at the experiences of, these groups, and look at, race or racial identity, these aspects, look at these constructs and really see what it really means, and not just focusing on, just demographics and just kind of have people check a box. And really kind of to repeat what Kevin talked about, how important culturally relevant instrumentation is. I mean, you can't just take any instrument and then and not know how and why it was created, and then use it using at least for me and the work I did with the African American population, and then draw some conclusions, and and then the instrument wasn't designed for African American people. So you have to really think about what instruments you're using, why were they made, how were they created, and if they're not culturally relevant, you're gonna have to make some changes. Are you gonna have to modify that instrument? Are you gonna use it, create your own instrument? So there's a lot that you need to think about in terms of the instrumentation you're using. If you're working with, and studying experiences of people of color, you need to use instruments that are relevant for those groups of people. So culturally relevant instrumentation is really important. And a big one for me, I think you need to be authentic when you're doing this work. I get very frustrated when people see that, there's money in, working, studying experience of Black students or Latino students or any group of students of color, and you really don't know anything. You don't have any Black friends. I mean, you don't even interact with Latino people, but yet you want to study this group of people. And so I think you need to have a relationship with the population that you're studying. I mean, I can't go and say, I'm going to study Native American, students, but I don't know enough about Native American culture. I'm not, connected to that community. I need to be connected to that community. I need to know that community. You should have a passion for that community in order to do that work. And I think if you're doing multicultural work and critical work, you need to have a passion for the people that you are studying. I do work with about African American people because I really care about African American people. I am African American, so what I'm studying, education or whatever context, it's important to me what I study. I study African American students. I have an African American son, so it's really important for me to study their experiences in school because it impacts me, it impacts my community, all my relatives. It's just about everybody I know. So it's really important to me. And so I do have questions when I see people who are, I say, opportunists, because studying these different groups of people can get them to certain places. So I really do like promoting multicultural or critical methods, but I'm very weary about it because I now see that's the hot thing that people are wanting to do. But you need to be committed to doing this work, because for me, it's not just a lens I use for a study, it's a lifestyle. It's just who I am. And it has to be, at least for me, it has to be more than just, what you do for a project.
Yeah, and I just want to big time second everything that got said. All excellent points. I love it. And I think the things I would add, in some of it's going to be just kind of piggybacking. It's not really like adding, but and this I'm trying to think of how to word this. I think the point about doing your homework is absolutely vital. Not in the sense of, well, we can never do anything until we, have read every paper that's ever been published in the universe on the thing, but rather, I do think that you can actually do harm if, you haven't really engaged the existing literature around these more critical perspectives, around work that fits this kind of ethos. So like, for example, it's possible that you could, just wake up tomorrow and you decide, I want to do anti-racist work. Oof, great. But if the way you approach that completely ignores that people have been doing this since a very, very, very long time ago at this point, since before I was alive, it's kind of like, well, okay, guys, at that point, you could actually do harm, because at that point you're not connecting to what already exists. You're not like being able to build off the existing kinds of critiques that were already there. And in some ways, I think the point that you made about like the issue of the opportunistic aspect, I think sometimes it may not even happen intentionally, but when you fail to connect to that existing base, then you'll wake up and here you are giving credit for things that you're not actually responsible for lack of a better way to put it. So the other things I'm thinking, though, I would say part of that doing your homework is, and this is not natural for us in our field, I think, avoid siloing. So there's this tendency to say, we just read people who are from our field, we read our field's journals, that is it. But I think in actuality, if this is what you want to be doing, if you think, critical perspectives and multicultural perspectives are somehow, a direction that makes sense and it's aligned with your value set, things like that, then I would go so far as to say you must be interdisciplinary or you will not be able to do your job. So, resist that tendency to just kind of have tunnel vision about who you're allowed to draw from, because in my experience, I found that some of the most generative experiences that I've had in my scholarship have come from talking to people who won't touch psychology with a 10-foot pole. But nonetheless are talking about things that are clearly relevant to ed psych, developmental psych, psychology writ large. The other piece that I would say, take reflexivity seriously, and that's the very qual in me speaking. So there, I would say, I think there's a tendency to think of it as just kind of saying, well, okay, here are the identities that I have, voila, done. But I think at core, it also involves thinking about like, well, so this is my day job. I get paid to do this. How does my day job inform like how I'm seeing all of this? Like, how does it, specifically the one that I think a lot about is, how does this inform what I believe is the theory of social change? What do I think is possible? How do I think these kinds of social justice outcomes are going to be achieved? And if I think because of my day job, it's like, well, I will publish an article and then someone will read it and then that's going to be the be all end all. I'm going to ask my questions a very particular way, as opposed to if, say, you think I need to empower people right now, regardless, in some other avenue. Like, there's lots of different ways to think about that. And then the last thing I would say, that's directly related to that last one, is thinking about what constructs and concepts you're using, and what is presumed about your phenomenon of interest by using those concepts and constructs. Because in a lot of ways, it kind of can give us blinders. Like, you basically end up with these goggles and you're like, oh, okay, but it's important to always kind of just ask from the outset, how, in what ways is this limiting what I'm allowed to even ask? That I'll stop there.
Well, thank you all so much for those perspectives. And I'm hoping that we can go, all of you spoke at this kind of high level, integrating some personal elements of your work. But I'm wondering if you can answer this question of how do these practices that you just reflected on inform the methods that you use in your work, how you collect data and analyze data for critical or multicultural research projects. So let's start with Dr. DeQueer Gunby. We'll move to Dr. Adams Wiggins and then Dr. Coakley.
Okay, I almost focus solely on experience of African American people and how they see the world. So the research questions I focus on tend to center on their racial experiences, particularly, like I said, in the educational context. I look at that pretty broadly. But I have done a little work in particularly in their work context as well. But and I use critical race theory as my general lens. And then as Colin said, if you're doing this kind of critical work, particularly critical race theory, is going to be intersectional in terms of the readings and the works that guide your research. And so, I mean, I pull from not, different areas of psychology. I pull from sociology, different areas, education, anthropology, wherever, law, lots of work on the law, and particularly for critical race theory. That's the center, that's the focus of it. To kind of guide the way I'm thinking, where I'm seeing, how I analyze what I'm looking at. And I tend to, when I do collaborate, I do a lot of collaborative work. I collaborate with people who have similar perspectives, because we can gel a little better, and we're able to produce something that I think kind of captures kind of the way we see African American experiences. But just because we have similar perspectives doesn't necessarily mean we come from different places. I rarely, when I'm doing a lot of my critical race theory work, I rarely collaborate with people in ed psych. I tend to collaborate with people outside of ed psych, come from more traditional education fields, like multicultural ed or curriculum, because they tend to be a lot more open to this work or have more experience in this work. But I use a variety of methods, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. Mixed methods tends to be my area of expertise. But regardless, I center everything on issues of race, racism, racial identity is race focused. My research questions, my data analysis, the constructs, everything I do, any instruments I have are all very race centered, race focused. My analyses, you can see that, definitely, a stream of race and racism all throughout everything that I do, because that's what I'm really interested in. Particularly for me, when I'm doing critical work, it's really all about race. That's because of the lens I use in critical race theory. There, of course, there are different ways to do critical work. It doesn't have to be about race, but for me, because I use critical race theory, that's the lens that I particularly use.
Yeah. So in my case, I think it's interesting because the majority of my work has been in science ed. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like, yeah, it's science ed. But at the same time, I think it shows up in my focus on marginal identities being produced in relation to science identity as a process. So basically, kind of like turning it on its head and not just saying, well, okay, so how do we get kids to be more scientific, but also, well, what might be some reasons that maybe this is a more complicated question? Are there going to be scenarios where to become scientific is to ask you to be a kind of person that you should not want to be, that kind of thing. And then the other piece where I think it's a little more straightforward is my work around racialized identity processes in Black youth, which that I've had limited work that's publicly available at this point on that. So I think in terms of how did the practices inform that, I think one giant way that it informed it is that that's literally the reason why it took so long for my work on racialized identity processes to really be kind of put forward, because of the fact that part of it was time. I needed to form the kinds of relationships that I thought were ethical to do the kind of work I wanted to do. I will be the first to tell you every day, all day, I do not buy the argument that qualitative methods are inherently emancipatory. You can use qualitative methods to do oppressive work. It's 100% possible to do that. So I don't think it was enough to just be like, oh, well, I'm interviewing middle schoolers about their lives, and then they get to have their own voice, and that's enough. There's more to it. I could have done harm pretty easily. And not just that, but in terms of the fact that I'm coming from, I would say, more traditional critical theory kind of angle. Because of that, it's meant that, well, okay, I want to ask these things that really actually are pointing directly to structural questions that are not necessarily as readily accessible in the immediate context or not as typically addressed in the methods that are normative in my field. So with that, excuse me, with that being the case, it also has meant that I have to take the time to get to understand, well, okay, so what's this local context? What's the history of this local context? What's the best approach to actually collecting data in the first place here? Because I would say it requires kind of a careful determination of, well, who like what are the data sources going to be, and then to just kind of wrap it on the science ed stuff that I've done. I think the way it's shown up there is, I mean, it's why I ended up collecting interview-based data and not just relying on the observations, because I believed it was important to understand the perspectives of the people who were being, who I was trying to explain their behavior. But also, I would say it's not, yes, I'm not sure it's really, like, I guess it influenced it in terms of how heavily I was relying on theories from outside of ed psych to be able to think about the analysis. So like for there, I'm thinking of like the status legitimation stuff, because that I had to go dig back in it further to be able to say something about the process that I knew was actually more important in what I was doing. So.
All right. Ditto to everything that has already been said. One of the things that I'm always very clear about is that race and culture center the work that I do, regardless of sort of, the questions that race and center always remain at the forefront, at the center of all the work that I do. So I have to confess that part of me gets a little bit nervous, in this sort of setting, because I'm not an educational psychologist, right? I was not trained as an educational psychologist. I am trained as a counseling psychologist, but I'm a counseling psychologist who has educational interest. And so I feel like, so you can appreciate sort of my work on the imposter phenomenon, because I feel like a bit of an imposter trying to talk about, educational psychology with educational psychologists or people who are actually trained in educational psychology. So I feel like I need to kind of say that up front. But for me, part of the way that I approach my work is greatly informed by someone who was my intellectual mentor, or in the parlance of sort of African-centered psychology, my Jegna, and that is Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Asa Hilliard, well-known educational psychologist at Georgia State University, where I completed my PhD. He was also a well-known Egyptologist. He was a tireless defender of Black students and their ability to learn, and he poured into me sort of all that I am today. And so one of the things that I learned from him is that you can't, if you really want to be an effective teacher of African American students, if you want to do culturally competent research, on African American students, that you can't rely solely on psychology to inform how you approach that work. For him, again, he spanned across many different disciplines. And so when I think about the work that I do, my work is informed not only by psychology and the different sort of branches of psychology, but it is informed by anthropology, it is informed by history, it is informed by sociology. It is informed especially by Black studies. I'm very much immersed in Black studies. I am an active member of the National Council of Black Studies. And in fact, some of the most profound, sort of issues that I've addressed have come from my engagement in African American studies as it relates to African American students. I remember just, a few years ago when, the book about sort of the supposed anti-intellectualism amongst African American students sort of came out by John McWhorter. And this was a book, and John McWhorter was a linguistic scholar, and he made the decision to write about educational issues of Black students, and suddenly was sort of seen as an expert. And those of us who actually have been toiling in relative obscurity doing this work were somewhat offended because he was making really problematic statements and assertions about Black students and Black culture. Saying that Black folks had a culture of anti-intellectualism, which was the reason that Black students underperformed relative to other groups. So many problematic things, and it takes someone who goes, in my opinion, who is well-read, who is well-versed, who is informed by multiple disciplines, to be able to sort of attack that type of critique, to do the work that we are doing. And so it was important for me to do that, but it was people like Asa Hilliard who really modeled how you go. When Asa Hilliard attacked the book, The Bell Curve, written by psychologists and a political scientist, and he talked about the 7 or 8 cracks in the bell curve. I'll never forget reading that piece. And he did a systematic sort of just taking that whole bell curve argument apart intellectually. And so when I saw that, I said, that's what I want to do. That's how I want to use my training as a psychologist and my interest in Black students to defend their integrity. So for me, psychology is important, but it is insufficient if you only rely on psychology as a means to sort of go about this critical and multicultural work. You really have to go well beyond the scope of our training, in my opinion, to do the work that needs to be done.
Well, thank you so much for those ideas. Our last question is really going to build on some of what you just talked about, Dr. Coakley, which is considering how do you have conversations with students, whether that's in teaching context, mentorship, research, and also other collaborators, about bringing these methods into their ways of thinking or their approaches to critical and multicultural research. So let's start with Dr. Adams-Wiggins. We'll move to Dr. Coakley and then Dr. Duclair-Gunby.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's been slightly easier with students, because in many cases they're gravitating towards me because they already kind of want to do that. So it's like, okay, we're at least ethically on the same page here. So then the conversation is more about, well, okay, so what is it that you would need to read to be able to start digging into the things that you do care about, that I care about, that maybe I don't know that I care about, but I know that you care about something that's important, and I just want to help you get there, kind of thing. So I think there it's notably more straightforward. I think probably the more challenging piece of it is it's often that it's like, okay, well, what is considered canon and is in the syllabus for all of your coursework is not necessarily going to cover what I'm about to tell you need to cover. So now it's the uphill battle of, okay, I know you're strapped for time as a graduate student or undergraduate at times. And how am I going to convince you to actually, really dig into this extra stuff that in many cases is kind of dense anyway, and a lot of the time, like, many people just don't have time for it, kind of thing. So that's there. But I do encourage students to do things like take courses in other departments. Like in my institution, one that I regularly send students to take is decolonizing research methods, because that can give them some level of kind of a push forward, and at least kind of get them a little more well-versed in just, well, why are we even doing things the way we do them? The piece with collaborators, I think, is actually slightly more challenging, because it's often a matter of, well, figuring out, well, okay, so how do I figure out who the most logical collaborator is for this based on what I can bring to the table? In my personal experience, I've had it be either I can't find people inside my own general area of specialty who are reading the same things, or at least want to continue, like want to go that direction. Or when I find people who I'm like, oh wow, they're like, I'm really with that. They often are far enough along with it that I feel like I'm a drag on this, because like I feel like I don't know enough or something like that. So I think in some ways it's been kind of having to get comfortable and acknowledging it's like, well, okay, this was not very much of my training. I'm learning this because I need it in my toolbox if I'm going to do things the way I think they should be done.
So I am a storyteller. And so when I am working with my students, I like to tell stories about my own personal experiences, sort of in some of the challenges that I've encountered in the way that I do my work. I do this, through my teaching. I do this through my mentorship. I like to, do this in terms of, the research that I do as well. And, one of the examples that I think students really appreciate, and this isn't my own personal story, but this is a story that I share, was an example of an African-American man who was interviewing for a job, and he was he had an all African-American sample. He was dealing with a construct that was specifically rooted in African-American experience. So he gives a talk, and after the talk, he says that one of the white members of the audience asked him why he didn't have a white control group. And so his response to the person was, "What would I be controlling for?" And he said, and he described the individual's faces as getting red and starting to stammer because the individual could not answer the question. He's like, "What would I be controlling for? I've told you that this construct is rooted specifically in the African-American experience. It has no relevance to white people. So could you explain to me what would I be controlling for?" As it turns out, he didn't get the job. But sometimes we got to go out like that, because to make the point that white people are no longer the standard by which all other behaviors are measured. And so we have to continue to push back and to challenge this sort of hegemonic practice within the work that we do if we're ever going to make progress. So I'll stop there.
Whew, I strongly agree with both of them that said, definitely about, I've been there, Kevin, asked about, why don't you have this control? I've been there. But I think I just want to add one thing we hadn't talked about, but I believe that this work is really hard. It can be emotionally difficult. And I think if you're going to do this work, you need to engage in self-care. This work can be really hard. I recently did a study, it was, I talk about race all the time. I talk to participants about race all the time. And so racism all the time. So I'm not used to asking those kind of questions. And one time, one of my grad students was doing a standard interview, and he talking to a student, a young woman, about her experiences with racial microaggressions at school and in college. And she talked about being sexually assaulted. And we just didn't expect that to come out. And so, systems of oppressions are intersectional. And so as she started talking about her experience with racial microaggressions, the gender racial microaggressions came out, and then she talked about the sexual assault, because of all her experiences were intertwined. And that just really it just startled my whole group, and they really impacted us, because I was a mandatory reporter. She had been sexually assaulted at another university, so I had no obligation to report, but it brought up all these different things about, worrying about the student and who she was, and to think about how, and then of course the pandemic, all these different things going on, and how difficult but that was just one story, but we hear all these stories, and I've been doing this work for a long time, and then all these other people I read been doing this work for a long time, and it gets really upsetting because the stories haven't changed and they keep on going. And then we keep on hearing about police, African-American men getting killed by police, and the stories keep on happening. And so it gets weighty, it gets difficult. And sometimes you have to step away and take care of yourself. And as I mentioned, I do this work because I deeply care about this work. And so that's why, for me, I have to engage in self-care, because, just hearing the stories, because I care about my participants. I'm rooting for them. I want them to do well. But when I hear about their stories, I want to tell their stories. But telling their stories can be painful as well. So self-care.
Well, thank you all so much for those responses. We're going to have some time to engage the panelists with some questions from all of you in a bit, but first we're going to allow some time to really do this work to digest these ideas. So we're going to start moving into small groups, breakout rooms, and I'm going to pass things along to Corey to introduce that work. Certainly want to thank you all for your work in those rooms. Through some of the conversations that I was privy to in the breakout rooms, wanted to chat through one question and definitely pose some others in the chat if there are others floating around still. But I'd love for our panelists to consider for us, how do you think about connecting or situating structures and systems in your methods when doing work that might focus a little bit more at the individual level? And let's start with Dr. DeKirkby then.
Yeah, that's a good one. How do you think about situating structure and systems? Well, CRT is, the goal of CRT is to impact and to change structures, systemic racism. So that's the ultimate goal. I do think a lot of the work that I do is on an individual level. So I think the goal is, how do you get individuals to work together to make systemic changes? That's the way that I can most explain it to it, because systems don't change unless individuals help to change them. And so that's one way, but then there's also policy. Educational psychologists don't necessarily do a lot of work in policy, but there has been some movement to get educational psychologists at least aware of and actually maybe more policy focused in their work. So if we can start doing more policy engaged work, research, then that'll actually impact systems. So I think there's multiple ways to actually engage in doing that.
I think I'll just put it out there out front. I consider myself a Vygotskian, so I think in some ways that might matter a lot here, because even when we're talking about quote individual level constructs, I generally am taking a set of assumptions that says anything that's operating at the individual level actually originates at the social level in the first place. So any kind of talk about these individual level kinds of questions is going to be fundamentally a discussion of social production of whole societies and that sort of thing. So with that being the case, and in our breakout, we were just talking about this, I actually recommend Barbara Rogoff's Apprenticeship in Thinking, as well as the one I didn't mention was Wirt's Vygotsky and the Social Formation of Mind. Either of those, I would say, kind of sums up a good bit of what I'm talking about, but in the sense, basically, I think in my work, it allows me to be able to just kind of talk directly about these kind of social structures that I'm starting from the assumption exist in the first place. It allows me to start redesigning my approaches to data collection, like the kinds of questions I would ask in an interview, or the kinds of interactions I would look for on video. By having that kind of theoretical framework there, it makes it, in my experience, it makes it significantly easier to, it makes it significantly easier to describe and explain these things in a way that I think aligns with the reality of the data sets, so to speak. I'll stop there.
So part of my training as a counseling psychologist was always to emphasize the interaction between the person and the environment, the person-environmental interaction. And so there's no psychological construct that I work with which is invariably conceptualized at the individual level. There's no psychological construct that I work with that I don't place within a larger context of the environment. So, for example, if academic motivation, right? To me, when examining academic motivation with Black students, I don't approach that work, I don't conceptualize that work without situating Black students within predominantly white educational spaces, within the attitudes that they have to contend with from teachers who have all sorts of, preconceived notions about Black students, and how that then manifests in how they approach and interact with students who then sort of respond in kind. so for me, my work is inherently sort of connected to institutions, to social systems, to the environment, because that is a way that I conceptualize all individually based psychological constructs, particularly as it relates to African American students. Which is why, for example, many years ago, when I was especially focused on issues of achievement, I created a student-professor interaction scale, because I believe that for African American students, that you really need to understand their interactions with professors to really understand or to better understand questions around their achievement.
Well, thank you. So we are very grateful, all panelists, for your time. We'd love for you to leave us with one last thought in about a sentence or so. What do you want people to carry with them as they start or continue pursuing critical and multicultural research? And let's go in the same order, so we can do Dr. DeQueer-Gunby, Dr. Adams-Wiggins, and then Dr. Copley.
Well, I just want to reiterate, something we've talked a lot about, but I think it's really important. I think you have to be committed to doing critical work. This isn't something that you just do for one study. Like I think for this next study, I think I'm just going to do this, critical lens. This is something that you just have to have a commitment to, and want to engage in this work and be willing to put in the work and the time to learn how to do it. And for me, it's something that I live. I don't. I live, I think about, I have a multicultural approach and critical approach to everything that I do. I think about this, when I'm watching the news, when I'm talking to my son about just simple things, when I'm teaching in my class, everything I do is structured. So when I go to my service activities and I'm in a meeting, I'm thinking in that way. So it impacts everything I do. And so I think, it's my positionality. So I think you have to have this commitment, really think about, is this really something that you really want to do? Or this is something that you see as this kind of hot thing that people are talking about now and you just want to jump on that bandwagon? So, this work is really hard. This is not easy work. I do mixed methods work. So mixed methods work in itself is just hard. And then to put the critical component on top of it is even more difficult. So, you have to be willing to commit to engaging in something that's difficult, when you combine it with the methodology as well. And it's also hard because, emotionally it's difficult because, you're studying issues like race, and you might be studying, gender issues, and just studying discrimination, these very difficult topics. It's difficult, to talk about. Some people may be resistant to talk about. Their stories just may be very emotional. So it can be really difficult for you as a researcher, difficult for your participants, and you have to be willing to take on that challenge. It also means something to the people that you're studying. When I'm talking to African American people and I'm having them share their stories about experiences with racism, their stories really mean something to them, and it's really important for them that I'm taking time to listen to their stories. And so you have to take, it's a seriousness about you going on to do this kind of work. So you just have to be committed to doing this kind of work.
I guess what I would say is that maybe just kind of keep in mind that it's all a pretty long process in terms of just being able to do this kind of work. So it might be difficult, it might require a lot of time up front to just feel even halfway competent in what you're trying to do. But I think it's important to just, if this is an ethical orientation that you are committed to, that you want to bring to your work, you should just continue to do that. There will be times that you're not rewarded for it. But I think if it's important to you, you should stick to it and continue to put the effort into developing the skill set that it takes to do this work well. Yeah, I guess the only other thing that comes to mind for me is to make sure you reflect on, well, what are the practical implications of the work you're doing? Because in many ways, it's not just a matter of, well, what methods did I use, but it's, well, what kinds of future possibilities open up based on what I chose to do with my work. And, I do primarily qualitative work. I am not of the mind that I would never, ever, do a quantitative study. But as of right now, it doesn't look like those are the kinds of questions that are being foregrounded for me. But I would say in everyone's case, think carefully about, well, particularly if you're coming from like, I'm a critical scholar. I consider myself a critical developmentalist. So thinking about, well, what is the change that is going to be advanced by the work I'm doing, and thinking carefully about just the questions that you're choosing to really put your effort into.
So again, I'm just going to co-sign on what has already been said. When I teach my issues in multicultural research class, part of the purpose of that class is to talk about all of the challenges that exist in doing this type of work. Doing critical and multicultural research is difficult. It is not easy. So it's one thing to sort of like, to do research where you don't have to have any sort of considerations of race or culture or ethnicity. But once you start to have those as considerations, and once you start to do it critically, then you start to ask different types of questions. So beyond, can I get access to this population? That's, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of research needs, can I get access to these diverse populations? So let's say that we have access. So once you get access, now I want to ask certain types of questions that involve constructs that have been one, operationalized in ways that may or may not be considered of sort of culture, and that two, certainly have been operationalized in ways that aren't considered of sort of culture. And so then you have to sort of ask different questions. Can I do research with these populations with instruments that have not been normed, validated in any sort of meaningful way on these populations? What is the risk that I run in using those scales? Do I run the risk of drawing conclusions that are deficit oriented, but that's due in part to the problematic way in which the instruments are operationalized, or the way in which they sort of define certain constructs? So doing this research requires us to ask harder and more difficult questions. It requires additional work, and it's a challenge that is rewarding, certainly, but it is not easy. And so you have to go into this with eyes wide open, and you have to truly, as both Jessica and Carolyn have said, you have to be committed to the work, and not opportunistic, but truly committed to doing this work.
Well, thank you all so much. I would love for us to show some appreciation with an emoji, your favorite reaction, for all of our panelists. And wanted also to give you a preview of our next session that is coming up next month on March 29th. In this one, we'll have an open conversation on the history and state of dissemination of multicultural and critical research. So hope you'll all come ready to reimagine some of our publishing spaces to intentionally include this type of scholarship, and also consider alternative pathways toward communicating our work. So you can register for that here. But ultimately, we really hope that you'll continue to be part of this community and encourage others to join in. But wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We so look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you once again to all of our panelists.